History Camp discussions to you each week. We are excited today to have Susan Nagel with us. Susan received her PhD from New York University and lives in New York City. She has written for the stage and screen, as well as the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and Town and Country. And she is the author of several books, including her new book coming out just this week, Patriotism and Profit, Washington, Hamilton, Schuyler, and the Rivalry for America's Capital City. Thank you so much for joining us, Susan.
It's my pleasure.
Well, Susan, this is so interesting. Let's start for just a minute with the traditional narrative. And then at a high level, take us through what your conclusion is, maybe how that varies, and then we'll take a deeper dive.
Well, if you look on Wikipedia, it says that one of the greatest compromises in this country's history was the dinner table bargain of 1790. And of course, that's nonsense, because the rivalry for America's capital city and the idea of federal funding for the war debt was a very long-standing argument. And George Washington actually wanted both the federal funding, and because he lived near Alexandria and helped develop the town, he wanted a capital city near Mount Vernon. He owned a lot of land along the Potomac, and he had really investments into making that happen.
Well, let's then introduce another player that some people may know from a recent musical, Philip Schuyler. So talk to us about the lives of Philip Schuyler and George Washington and how they were so similar, really, leading up to the war.
They were very similar, but also different. Philip Schuyler was born into the Dutch clans, and their system was kind of a feudal system. They had huge amounts of property along the Hudson River in New York City and a little bit west on the Mohawk River up near Saratoga. And he inherited all of his property. George Washington was a younger son of a second wife, and he was not destined to be a land grandee. And he had to earn a lot of his property, but they grew up both dreaming of a way westward. You know, in those days, America was hugged along the coastline, and both Washington and Philip Schuyler were just obsessed with going west and finding a way to build canals to link us to the Ohio River, the Great Lakes. And they both dreamed of this at very early age. A lot of the early citizens along the coast never went west to meet Native Americans, and that the two of them were very interested in learning the Native American language and their customs. And they both headed to the interior of our continent, and a lot of other people didn't do that.
And at that point, the interior was places as far west as Ohio?
Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. That was considered wilderness, absolute wilderness.
So let's then talk a little more about kind of the landholding aspect and how the value or the what the impact would have been depending on the location of the capital.
Well, of course, you would have a lot of wealthy representatives spending money. And of course, the prestige of having the capital city there. In the past, in the history before this, most capital cities in the world, the beginnings of empire, became a center of that empire. It would be the center of commerce, of government, of all kinds of innovation. And so that was a very, very prestigious and important thing, whether it was New York City or Philadelphia or the swamp town that Washington created, Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think it's hard sometimes for us to remember the stature, the status, the relative sizes, and so forth, right? Because we know where we are today, but of New York, Philadelphia, and now Washington D.C. So, as you said, it's a swamp, not an obvious choice to cite a capital, especially since the capital at one point had been, Philadelphia, New York, and so forth, right? So, talk to us about why. Kind of what George Washington saw in that, and maybe how he was able to convince others beyond the obvious convenience for him and possible, financial impact. surely everyone else is like, well, Georgia, of course, right? It's a short ride from where you live.
It was so much more than convenience. It was about owning the land along the river. And Washington had amassed thousands, tens of thousands of acres along the Potomac River into what is now West Virginia. And it was about, making money along the river. And we inherited a system from Europe until the Constitution was written. A lot of the efforts were privately funded, and you would also get investors and not government funding to go ahead and build canals or to make money. People collected tolls, as they used to in Europe. If somebody wanted to send a barge up the river past your property, you could actually collect tolls. So it was a lot about profit. And Washington and his Virginia friends were desperately trying to beat the New Yorkers because it was a very natural route between the Hudson River, the Mohawk River, and the Great Lakes. As we know, the Erie Canal later became a monster hit. And George Washington had obstacles in his way because some of the Potomac River you weren't able to clear it, like the Great Falls and around Washington, D.C.
And so let's talk a little more than what were some of the arguments he used? Take us through that discussion, the back and forth around why, again, this non-obvious choice became the most important choice.
Because it was his choice. And in those days, the Potomac River was owned by the state of Maryland. So he had to get approval from the state of Maryland to work with him. And he would work like crazy and went to Maryland. He wrote a letter to James Madison that he was so exhausted on Christmas Eve, but he was going to stay until it was accomplished. So this was sort of interstate cooperation of very rich men who owned land along the Potomac River. And they formed canal companies, and they made George Washington president and gifted him a huge amount of the shares. He was the largest single shareholder in the Potomac Canal Company. He served as president of the Canal Company while he was president of the United States.
How interesting. Now we've heard about the dinner table bargain.
Mm-hmm.
Take us through again, we kind of started with this, and people may know that story, but how was that resolved? Was it resolved over one large dinner meeting? How long did these discussions go on?
There may have been a dinner party at Thomas Jefferson's house. There may have been a discussion. It resolved nothing. The fighting went on for weeks and weeks after that. And this had been such a long battle between best friends, Philip Schuyler and George Washington, meaning the Virginians in one camp, the New Yorkers in another, that this story actually by Thomas Jefferson, he actually started writing this a couple of years afterward to put himself in the middle. He had actually been in France until the spring of that year. This battle had gone on for so long. So he inserted himself to become, kind of the great negotiator. He also cleaned up George Washington's reputation, because in a founding story in all mythology, you have to have a hero. So he sanitized the story, keeping Washington out of it and inserting himself. And it seemed that this all happened organically at this wonderful dinner party over great wines at his, house. And it really didn't. This had gone on for so long, and there had been so many obstacles, and the New Yorkers and the Virginians were lobbying behind the scenes to get votes. And really, Washington was the mastermind of the whole thing. I don't want to give the exciting details of who he lobbied, who changed their votes, and what happened to those poor guys. But basically, he was a masterful politician.
Well, and certainly he was held in extraordinarily high regard. Right,
yes,
yes,
absolutely. By the way, he and Philip Schuyler had the same nemesis, Mr. Gates, who wanted to get rid of both of them, and of course wanted to be the supreme general, commander-in-chief. So they sympathized over that. And Washington loved visiting Philip Schuyler. He was godchild to one of his children. They were really the closest of friends. He would take notes about Schuyler's style because Schuyler was born with so much money. And of course, Schuyler went over to see the Bridgewater canals in England. Lots of people came to visit Philip Schuyler, and Philip Schuyler had built a small canal system upstate New York to help our soldiers combat the invaders, during the Revolutionary War. So Ben Franklin, the Carrolls of Maryland, who were involved with George Washington on the Potomac, they all came to visit to see what was Philip Schuyler doing with all these canals, and how can we do it too?
Yeah, it's so interesting. We were talking just a minute ago about the relative sizes of the cities today and kind of their status and importance and so forth. And I think people think of the railroads, for example, right, as really changing this country and leading in part to the great expanse westward. But again, hard to imagine the huge impact that canals had and that critical role in those early days. Talk to us a little about, give us some years on this so that we're understanding exactly when this is taking place. Roughly, kind of when did this discussion begin, and when was the ultimate decision, the ultimate vote?
Well, both men were born in the early 1730s, within a year or so of each other. Both men served in the 7 Years' Wars. Both of them, as I said, traveled to the interior. And from the time they were, teenagers and in their 20s, they were fascinated by canal systems and they wanted to head westward. After the Revolutionary War, about 1784, New York State passed a bill saying, we authorize you to create a canal system in the state. Virginia turned around and said, we better do it too right away. So 1784 was a really essential year. And that year also, John Jay came back from the Paris negotiations, and he lived in New York City. And Congress had been roving. That's a whole other story, which is very exciting because it was a mutiny where they attacked and invaded the State House in Philadelphia. So invading our Congress and House of Representatives began in 1783. So John Jay comes home and they offer him the Secretary of State job. And he says, no, you're in Trenton, New Jersey. I live in New York City. I really want to stay at home. So just about Christmas 1784, people were returning to their homes. And John Jay rode down to Trenton and said, well, think about it if you move to New York City. And they all said, sure, why not? Whoever was left, most of them had already gone. Well, this so upset the Virginians because they thought once you get to New York City, nobody's going to want to leave. And that was pretty true. And that's what started my interest in the whole story, because between 1785 and 1790, New York rebounded from having been a loyalist town and practically burned to the ground. Theaters and dancing parties and all kinds of fantastic activity. Why would you want to leave New York City? Even Abigail Adams, who, did a lot of drinking, when they said, oh, we're leaving New York, and she said, oh, it won't be Broadway.
Now, was that really the reference? It won't be Broadway?
It won't be Broadway. Lower Broadway was where it was at. All the mansions, all of the fun theaters, John Street Theater, stuff like that. It was really a great place to have the capital. And there was a very, very active group of young society people who were also quite progressive. They started abolitionist societies and hospitals. So it was a bustling town, much like the 1980s in New York City. And that kind of interested me, that parallel. And then why would you leave New York? Everybody was having a great time.
I had no idea that Broadway was Broadway back then.
Broadway was Broadway.
Fascinating. So let's bring in Alexander. Speaking of Broadway, let's bring in Alexander Hamilton. Yes. What role did he play in all of this?
Poor Alexander Hamilton. Thomas Jefferson was so jealous that he created this story. And as the musical says, Hamilton sold New York City down the river. That's not what happened. And he was, caught between his father-in-law and his surrogate father, George Washington. And he, was miserably unhappy about this whole situation because the two men were vying for the capital, and then Thomas Jefferson blamed him.
And just to clarify, Hamilton's father-in-law was
Philip Schuyler, yes.
So we talked a couple of minutes ago about Jefferson kind of sanitizing perhaps this discussion, placing himself in the middle of a very gentlemanly way to resolve all of this. And you said that took place a few years after the actual incidents. Is that right?
Yeah, he tried it out in a couple of letters to George Washington, and he tried it out in his own diaries and journals, and then later it became published because his journals were published, the NS. And so he tested the water, as they say, to see if the story would work, and nobody questioned it because they didn't really mind it.
How interesting. So let me step aside from the story itself and talk about writing this book, writing this story. So this is a really interesting narrative. Why do you think it's been this long before somebody has written the book that you've written?
There's actually two reasons. One is people are afraid to say anything bad about George Washington. And I'm not saying anything bad about George Washington. I'm actually admiring his entrepreneurship. Everything he did on his farm, like Philip Schuyler, butchered, milled, grew. They tried to find a business, a commercial way to benefit from that. And so one of the reasons that people haven't attacked this is people are afraid to, quote, topple him off a pedestal. The other reason is they don't do their homework. As somebody with a PhD, I love to dig into the original letters. And I read the letters, and they are absolutely conclusive. I mean, George Washington wrote to family members, I want you to suss out this piece of land near Pittsburgh. Just don't tell them that I'm the one buying it. And he wrote letters about the lawsuits he was involved in. He tried to throw people off his land. So if you want to say, that George Washington is this perfect and unflawed human being, I just don't buy that. And I like the idea of our first president of the United States being the first real estate developer president of the United States. And that's who he was. And it was a big part of who he was.
I think one of the things that we feel from so many of our history camp talks is that the real history is so much more interesting.
Well, every human being is flawed. So the fun part is to look at these guys and go, who were they jealous of? Who did they admire? What were they reading? That's really important. George Washington was not educated like some of our other founding fathers. He was an autodidact. He read like crazy.
Well, so let's talk a little more about that research and so forth. Now, there's the Gilder Lehrman Library. Where were some of the places that you found these letters? And I'm also interested in, and maybe this is just my shortcoming, how do we know what George Washington was reading? Was it also in the letters?
Well, he used to check books out of the New York Society Library, and also in his orders that he placed for books for himself and his stepson Jackie, and he would provide a list. Please get me this, and that, and I'll pick it up on Monday. And I found the most wonderful, wonderful source of founding fathers information is an online portal called Rotunda, provided by the University of Virginia. And I started working there, over 10 years ago. They've got Thomas Jefferson letters, George Washington letters, Dolly Madison letters, and they have annotated them as well. So you can actually read the letters and cross-reference some of the notes and go to somebody else's letters, and it confirms, yes, George Washington was here on September whatever, or, the two letters match up. You sent me one on the 15th and I received yours on the 17th. Because communication by post was so insecure in those days, they actually would write that a lot in the letters. I received your letter dated March 22, and here is my response.
How interesting. We will put the link to that resource in the chat so people can check it out. So we talked about the different cities. Was Philadelphia in the running as a possible location? And did it simply lose out to New York, and then the choices were New York and Washington?
Well, after the mutiny in 1783, when 500 soldiers surrounded the State House, pointing bayonets at our founding fathers, nobody wanted to go back. And the governor of Pennsylvania refused to help them out. So there were two things that they learned after that day. Number one, they did not want to go back to Philadelphia. And number two, they did not want a federal government within the jurisdiction of a state. And of course, that would go right into the Constitution, that the federal district would be a 10 square mile and it would have sovereignty.
And let's talk a little more about that. At what point?
Sorry, I was going to say, and by the way, later on, when this was really a heated debate and they were all in New York City, you had South Carolinians who liked to, even though they were from the South, they would come up by ship. And they did not want to go to Philadelphia because of the abstemious Quakers. They found them boring. They liked New York. They wanted to drink. They wanted to gamble. They wanted to go to the theater. And so the South Carolinians were the outliers in the Southern Bloc and said, no way, we're not going to Philadelphia anyway.
Well, Washington, D.C., at what point did it start being called Washington, D.C.?
That's a really good question, because he wanted to call it, George Washington wanted to call it District of Columbia. And I don't know at what point people started calling it Washington's DC, but it was really Washington's DC because he evicted people in Georgetown and said, I want this land. He did all kinds of things to build his capital city, his empire city. And much like, great emperors in the past, this was going to be the shining monument, his legacy.
So we know about the laying out of the city. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's so easy to navigate with that grid system and the diagonals. Let's talk a little more though about the borders. Now you said that there'd been an agreement with Maryland. Is that right? To provide land?
Well, as I said, the Potomac River was the old charters that we got from England were a real mess. And that caused a lot of disputes, even after the Revolutionary War, among the states. Philip Schuyler had land east of the Hudson, and people in Massachusetts were claiming his land. So they hated Philip Schuyler. So Maryland owned the Potomac River. That was part of their land charter. So for the people on the Virginia side, to gain access to the Potomac, to make any money off the Potomac, they had to work with Maryland.
Interesting. And then talk to us about then the Virginia lines of demarcation and the ownership there. Was that all of Washington's property?
What do you mean by all of Washington's property?
Sorry, did Washington own that area?
Washington owned a lot of land along the Kanawha rivers, and he owned land toward Pittsburgh where the fort was. And so he was kind of hedging his bets that the Potomac would lead you up to the Ohio River one way or another. So his land, a lot of his land was in West Virginia. As a young man, when he had his first job, the first thing he did was buy land in the Shenandoah Valley. And he did not have land in the coastal tidewater land in Virginia, where the aristocratic families all had their properties, sort of toward Williamsburg, the York River, the James River. He was up along the Potomac and some of the other creeks and was not considered an aristocrat. His grandfather had purchased some land there, and that was considered, outback in a way. The poorer families lived up there because if you were an aristocrat and, you would be down near the Jamestown, Williamsburg, that area. He married into it, though.
Indeed. I want to jump back. We've talked about the location of the political capital. What went into deciding that New York City would really be the financial capital?
That just happened organically, because while they were there post-Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton became the first president of a bank, and Wall Street, basically, that happened organically. And there were one of the characters in the book is a guy named Alexander Dewar, who was involved in a little group of social families, the clans, the Dutch clans, and he became the first hedge fund guy in the history of the US, also the first hedge fund failure, ended up in jail. And that's a great story also.
It sounds like there needs to be an excerpt appearing in the Wall Street Journal or a similar financial or business publication. I love the idea of the first hedge fund being back then. I want to go back to one other historical reference that if people are not familiar with it, I'm sure they're curious about it at this point. And that is what happened with the surrounding, again, bayonets drawn surrounding the Independence Hall. Is that correct? And there in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And what brought that about? And then what brought the eventual resolution?
Well, they hadn't gotten paid. The soldiers hadn't gotten paid. And every state had its own jurisdiction. So if you committed a crime in Pennsylvania, you could swim across the river and go to another state, and you avoided prosecution. So our founding fathers escaped through a back window, took a boat over, a barge to another state, and then kept moving around from small, incommodious lodges. So if you can imagine them being in Princeton, New Jersey, and sharing beds, that's what happened. They went Trenton, they went, Annapolis, all over the place, and they didn't have a home. So it was finally that Christmas, 1784, when John Jay said, look, I'm tired. If you want me to be Secretary of State, you have to come to New York. And they said, oh, sure, okay. The consequences of that were enormous, because finally, the very rich New Yorkers like Philip Schuyler said, let's greet them well, and then they will stay. Every other place was deriding them because soldiers hadn't gotten paid, the country was in debt, and they didn't think, really a lot of the foreign nations didn't think we would last very long.
And that would not be an unrealistic expectation, right? We know kind of how it all turned out, of course, but would have been completely unsurprising, right? If it would have been a struggle and it wouldn't have become the United States we know today.
And I was going to say, I recently wrote an article for the Washington Post about infrastructure. When James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were working on the Constitution, they were so aware and upset about the rivalry between Virginia and New York, because it was most of their friends and family. They said, let's give Congress the power to fund infrastructure. Let's have Congress take over the canal systems, and then it will be for the public good and publicly owned. It was shot down.
How interesting. Well, Susan, this has been fascinating. Let me go back to one thing again, to just kind of put this historically in context. So the earliest discussions of finding an ultimate location began roughly when, and then again, the final decision being made roughly when?
Well, I would say that mutiny in June 1783 was the starter shot, because they were essentially homeless. People had dreamed for years to house the federal government, but there really was no reality to it until after the Revolutionary War. Where would we put this capital city? Now we're a new nation. So Philadelphia, of course, was the logical choice, because they had all met there for many years, and the Declaration of Independence was drawn up there. But after that mutiny, that invasion of our capital, they all just said no, and they're not going back. Of course, Pennsylvania continued to lobby over the next 6 years, 7 years, and everybody just said, well, we need your vote for these kinds of things, so let's negotiate on things like funding. How about that? So the backstory is there was a lot of negotiation going on to get both the funding bill and the removal from New York City to a swamp on the Potomac. It went on for a very long time, and Thomas Jefferson had very, very little to do with it.
Fascinating. So, Susan, this has been so interesting. What would you like people to take away from this, perhaps kind of richer, deeper understanding of who George Washington was?
I don't want people to condemn him for being an entrepreneur. I think it's a great thing. And our founding fathers all thought that profit was patriotic. If you create something your neighbors need, it's better, it's cheaper, it's faster. You're doing a wonderful service for your neighbors and for the country. You're making it prosper. So Washington was all about prosperity, and that was a patriotic thing. And so is Philip Schuyler and a number of our other founding fathers. So I'd like the audience, the reader, to know that these men were very complicated men. They were flawed like everybody, but their drive and energy that helped them put together things like an army, a constitution, was also seen in the private sector. And that was a very good thing for this country.
Wonderful. Well, this has been such an interesting discussion. Let me welcome back Carrie, who I believe has one or two other questions. We've covered so much ground. Thank you, Susan. Carrie?
All right. One question we're going to just kind of wrap up with is, how did this back and forth affect the friendship between George Washington and Philip Schuyler?
There was such deep respect, and they understood competition. However, once the Residence Act was passed, Philip Schuyler was very upset with George Washington because he had done it in a very underhanded way. But I don't think there was any other way to do it, frankly. And the people who believed Washington's stories or promises, they really suffered afterward.
Okay. And can you kind of expand on that a little bit? How did they suffer? What was the outfall?
I do not want to give away that part.
Okay.
Because it's all politics and it's really juicy. And I think that you have to read the thread of what was going on and who was made promises and where the capital city was actually supposed to be according to the Residence Act and where it ended up.
Okay, perfect. Well, on that note, we will just remind you that we have a link to Susan's book in the chat. It is just coming out this week. So jump in and check that out and you'll get all those juicy details. And of course, lots more that we weren't able to cover today. We will also put a link to the Rotunda site that she had referenced earlier in the chat as well. And if you enjoyed this, there are a few things that you can do to help us keep going and growing. Tell your friends about it, share your emails and social posts, and consider making a donation to the Pursuit of History. That's the nonprofit that brings these to you every week. Now, next week, we will be speaking with Sam Forman about early pioneers traveling from New England to Western Florida in what was then the frontier of the new nation. And it's a great adventure story. You will enjoy that. And this is actually the beginning of our fall season with Susan here. So Lee is showing you our flyer. You can download that and find out the whole lineup for the rest of the year at historycamp.org. So take a look at that as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
It's been really fun. Thank you.
Wonderful.